A cleaning lady approached a millionaire, advising him not to travel with his wife. The following morning, a luxury car was parked outside her modest house. Sophia wiped the sweat from her brow, her fingers trembling ever so slightly as she gripped the rag tighter. The scent of bleach hung in the air, mingling with a faint trace of high-end perfume that seemed to permeate every inch of the hotel room. For over 2 years, Sophia had been cleaning rooms occupied by guests who probably never even noticed she existed. They breezed past her, as if she were invisible, blending into the background like the marble floors or the sparkling chandeliers that adorned the lobby. That day began like any other. Sophia entered the suite of Ethan Carter, the well-known billionaire, with her usual routine in mind. Dust, vacuum, and be gone before anyone could even tell she had been there. Ethan was one of those men she'd never really seen up close. He was constantly coming and going, always flanked by assistants, never staying in his room for more than a few minutes. But today was different. As she dusted the nightstand, something caught her attention. Soft but sharp voices drifted through the adjoining room. Sophia froze, still holding her rag in her hand. Though it wasn't unusual to overhear conversations from other rooms, something about this one felt unsettling. Curiosity pulled her closer to the door. The woman's voice was unmistakably familiar, Clara, Ethan Carter's wife, whom Sophia had seen around the hotel on several occasions. But today, her tone wasn't one of affection. "He'll never see it coming," Clara whispered, her words thick with malice. Sophia's pulse quickened. "We'll make sure the trip is the last one he ever takes." A man's voice responded, low and chilling. Sophia didn't recognize him, but the tension was palpable. This was no casual chat. It was a scheme. Plot to kill. Her heart raced. Suddenly, she was acutely aware of her surroundings. The hum of the air conditioner, muffled voices from the hallway, the rapid beat of her own heart. Every fiber of her being screamed at her to leave, to ignore what she just heard, to return to her normal life of scrubbing floors and changing linens without getting involved. But her feet stayed rooted to the floor. "Liam, we need to be careful. One mistake and everything falls apart." Clara's voice cut through the silence, colder this time. "Liam." Sophia didn't know much about Clara, but she was certain her husband wasn't named Liam. This was more than a murder plot, it was a betrayal at its very core. The weight of what she'd overheard settled heavily in her chest. Clara and her lover were planning to kill Ethan Carter during his upcoming business trip, and no one had a clue. Sophia backed away from the door, her breath shallow and quick. What was she supposed to do now? Call the police? Tell someone? But who would take her seriously? She was just a maid, someone invisible to the likes of Clara and her wealthy circle. And even if someone did believe her, what if Clara and this Liam figured out she had overheard them? They clearly had no qualms about murder. In an instant, Sophia found herself standing alone in the middle of the suite, staring at her reflection in the flawless mirror. She felt small, insignificant, but somehow that smallness made her feel safe. They didn't know she'd heard anything. They didn't know who she was. She could slip back into the background like she always did. She could walk out of the room and pretend nothing had ever happened. Her fingers trembled as she continued dusting the room, each motion automatic while her mind raced in 1,000 directions. Maybe Ethan wasn't a good man. Most of the wealthy guests she cleaned for weren't. But did that mean he deserved to die? Did it mean she should stay quiet? By the time she finished cleaning the suite, her decision was made. She couldn't just turn a blind eye and allow someone to be killed. No matter the risk, she had to do something. Later that evening, Sophia sat in the staff lounge, staring at the mug of cheap coffee in front of her. She barely tasted it as her mind replayed the conversation over and over. What if Clara had seen her? What if Liam had noticed someone had been in the room? The thought sent a shiver down her spine. She had to be strategic. If she went directly to Ethan, he might dismiss her, maybe even laugh her off. And worse, what if Clara found out? But Sophia wasn't afraid. She didn't have much, but her conscience was intact. She couldn't let fear stop her from acting. She just needed to figure out how to warn him without revealing too much. The next morning, as Ethan Carter walked into the hotel lobby, Sophia spotted him from across the room, his commanding presence unmistakable, surrounded by his usual entourage. Her heart pounded as she walked toward him, rehearsing what she would say. She had only one chance. When she finally reached him, she cleared her throat, her voice trembling but resolute. "Mr. Carter," she called out, surprising even herself. He turned, eyeing her warily as his gaze fell on her name tag. "I need to talk to you about your trip," she continued, her voice steadying. "You shouldn't go. Something's not right." Ethan raised an eyebrow, clearly skeptical. "And why should I trust you?" he asked, his expression unreadable. Sophia swallowed hard, unsure of how to respond. But in that moment she knew one thing for sure. Whether he believed her or not, she had done what she could. She had warned him. Ethan Carter stood there for a moment, his eyes narrowing as if he were trying to decipher something hidden beneath Sophia's words. The hotel lobby buzzed around them, alive with the usual morning activity. Guests checking in, bellhops pushing luggage carts, businesspeople rushing out the doors. But for Sophia, time seemed to freeze. Her breath caught in her chest as she waited for his response. "I don't know what you think you know," Ethan finally said, his voice low but resolute. "But I don't make decisions based on vague warnings from strangers." A pang of panic gripped Sophia's heart. He wasn't going to believe her. Why would he? She was just the maid. Someone who blended into the background. Who was she to tell a man like him what to do with his life? But she couldn't back down now. "Please," she whispered, leaning in slightly so no one could overhear. "I can't explain everything. Just trust me on this. Don't go on that trip." For a moment something flickered in Ethan's eyes. Was it doubt? Curiosity? She couldn't tell. He straightened up, gave her one last look, and then turned to leave. "I'll think about it," he said over his shoulder, his voice dismissive, clipped. And just like that he disappeared into the crowd. Sophia stood frozen, watching him blend into the busy lobby. That was it. She had done all she could. The rest was up to him. Her heart was still racing as she made her way back to the staff quarters, her mind swirling with uncertainty and fear. What if he didn't take her seriously? What if Clara and Liam went through with their plan? The weight of what she had overheard pressed down on her, heavier than ever. The rest of her shift passed in a haze. She moved through the motions of cleaning, but her thoughts were elsewhere, replaying the conversation with Ethan and wondering what his next move would be. Was he the type to take a warning seriously, or would he just brush it off like so many other wealthy guests did? That evening, as Sophia walked home through the bustling streets of New York, she couldn't shake the feeling of dread that clung to her. The city was alive. Cabs honking, street vendors shouting, tourists snapping pictures, but all she could think about was the conversation she'd overheard in that suite. The air felt thick, almost suffocating, and she wondered if Clara and Liam had already sensed something was wrong. When she finally reached her small apartment, the silence hit her like a wave. She paced the narrow hallway, her mind spiraling with fear. What if they found out it was her? What if Clara had noticed something, maybe even suspected that she had overheard their plot? She tried to push those thoughts aside, but sleep didn't come easily. The following morning, as Sophia stepped out of her building, she froze in her tracks. Parked directly outside was a sleek black car, far too expensive for her modest neighborhood. It gleamed under the morning sun, an out-of-place beacon of wealth amidst the old brick buildings and cracked sidewalks. Her stomach twisted with unease. Who would be driving such a car here? And more importantly, who were they waiting for? She hesitated, considering turning back, but then she saw him, the driver, sharply dressed in a black suit. He stepped out of the car, adjusting his hat before locking eyes with her. Her heart skipped a beat as he walked toward her. For a moment every instinct in her body screamed at her to run, but she couldn't move. "Miss Sophia?" the man asked, his voice calm, controlled. She nodded, her voice failing her. He reached into his jacket pocket and pulled out a crisp white envelope, offering it to her. "This is for you." Her hand trembled as she took the envelope, her gaze flicking between the driver and the car. Who sent this?" she managed to ask, her voice barely a whisper. The driver gave a faint smile, tipping his hat. "Mr. Carter," he said simply. "He wanted to make sure you got it." A wave of relief washed over Sophia, quickly followed by confusion. What was this? She looked down at the envelope, its paper thick and expensive, her name written in elegant script. Without another word, the driver turned and walked back to the car, leaving Sophia standing there, her heart racing. Back in her apartment, Sophia sat at the small kitchen table, staring at the envelope as if it held the answers to everything. After a moment, she carefully slid her finger under the seal and opened it. Inside, she found a single note written in the same precise handwriting. "Thank you for your concern. I've decided to cancel the trip. Enclosed is something I believe you'll find useful." Sophia's hand shook as she pulled out a small, plain key from the envelope. Attached to it was a simple silver keychain with an engraving, "Wiltshire Towers." Her brow furrowed as she stared at it. Wiltshire Towers was a luxury apartment building downtown. A far cry from anything she could ever afford. Why was he sending this to her? Her phone buzzed, pulling her out of her thoughts. A message from an unknown number appeared on the screen. "Your new place is ready. Welcome to a fresh start, JW." Sophia blinked at the message, her mind scrambling to make sense of it. A fresh start? Was this real? Why would he do this for her? She had expected nothing more than a simple thank you, or maybe even nothing at all. But this? An apartment? Her life had always been modest, barely scraping by in her cramped little apartment. And now Ethan Carter, a man she barely knew, was offering her a new life. She stood up, pacing the room. This didn't feel right. There had to be more to it. Why would a billionaire care about a maid's warning? Why had he believed her? And why go through such lengths to thank her? As these questions swirled in her mind, Sophia realized that her life had just taken a turn she never could have predicted. She wasn't sure what the future held, but one thing was clear. Nothing would ever be the same. The sun was just beginning to set as Sophia made her way toward Wiltshire Towers. The key felt like a weight in her pocket, as if it was pulling her down with each step. A constant reminder of the bizarre turn her life had taken. She moved slowly, her steps uncertain. This couldn't possibly be real. The towering building ahead of her, its sleek glass reflecting the fading light of the city, seemed so distant, so out of reach. Why would Ethan Carter, a man who had everything, offer her? Someone like her. A brand new life. There was something unsettling about it, as though there was more to the story that she hadn't uncovered yet. But the note had been clear. A fresh start. The words echoed in her head as she stood in front of the building, her heart beating faster than she could control. The doorman greeted her without hesitation, like it was perfectly normal for people like her to walk through the door of a luxury building like this one. It was all too much. She had cleaned in fancy places, but this was different. She wasn't supposed to be here. She handed him the key, watching as he entered something into the system with practiced ease. "Miss Sophia, right? You're all set. The elevator is right over there. Take it to the 15th floor. "Thanks," she managed to say, her voice barely above a whisper, before stepping into the elevator. The door slid shut behind her with a soft swish, and the ride up felt like it lasted an eternity. Her pulse quickened with each passing floor, each number climbing higher, and when the doors finally opened, she had to remind herself to breathe. She stepped out into the hall, staring at apartment 1504, almost as though it wasn't real. She inserted the key into the lock, and it turned easily, almost too easily. As the door creaked open, her breath caught. The apartment was beyond anything she had ever imagined. Hardwood floors shone under recessed lighting, and the floor-to-ceiling windows offered a breathtaking view of the city. The space was pristine, everything about it polished to perfection. The modern furniture, the stainless steel appliances in the kitchen that looked as if they'd never been touched. She walked through the apartment in a daze, her fingers grazing the smooth surfaces of the counters, the soft fabric of the couch. None of this made sense. How could she go from scrubbing floors, living paycheck to paycheck, to standing in a place like this? The thought made her stop dead in her tracks. A wave of doubt and confusion hit her all at once. Why had Ethan done this? Was it gratitude? But this was far more than what a simple thank you should warrant. She sank into a chair, placing her head in her hands. Had she made the right decision? Warning Ethan had felt like the only thing she could do. She couldn't just stay quiet and let someone be hurt. But now, with this apartment, this life she didn't deserve weighing on her, she couldn't shake the feeling that something more was going on. A knock at the door broke her from her thoughts, and her heart skipped a beat. She stood up quickly and crossed the room to answer it, almost too afraid to see who it was. When she opened the door, a young man stood there holding a clipboard. He was dressed in a sharp black suit, casual enough to blend in, but professional enough to look out of place in her new world. His smile was warm, but there was something almost practiced about it. "Miss Sophia, I presume?" he asked, glancing at his clipboard. "Yes, that's me," she replied, her voice hesitant. "Good evening," he said. "I'm Evan, Mr. Carter's assistant. I've been instructed to show you around the building, give you a quick tour of the amenities, and make sure you're settled in." A tour? Sophia's mind was struggling to keep up with everything that was happening. "Yes," Evan continued, seemingly unfazed by her confusion. "Mr. Carter wants to make sure you're comfortable. He's very particular about his guests." Guests? Sophia's mind stopped at that word. Guests. That's all she was to him. A visitor in his world of wealth and privilege. Somehow, that knowledge didn't reassure her. If anything, it made her feel even more out of place. As Evan led her through the building, showing her the gym, the pool, and the private lounges, the contrast between her life and this one seemed even more glaring. She couldn't shake the feeling that she didn't belong here, that she was a ghost in a world she wasn't meant to inhabit. Every corner she turned, every room they entered, she felt more and more like an outsider. By the time they made their way back to the apartment, her mind was spinning. Evan handed her a small card with his contact details and a polite goodbye before leaving her alone once more. The silence in the apartment was deafening. Sophia sat on the edge of the bed, staring out at the city below, lost in thought. What was she supposed to do now? Was this really her life? What did Ethan want from her in return for all of this? The questions kept swirling in her head, but she was too tired to keep worrying. Eventually, she crawled into the bed, its soft sheets a stark contrast to the rough ones she was used to. Sleep came quickly, but it was filled with restless dreams, twisted and fragmented, filled with danger and whispered threats. The next morning, Sophia was jolted awake by the sound of her phone buzzing on the nightstand. Groggy, she reached for it, blinking at the unfamiliar number on the screen. Her pulse spiked, and she hesitated before answering. "Hello?" Her voice was thick with sleep. "Miss Sophia," the voice on the other end was brisk, businesslike. "This is Detective Anderson with the NYPD. I need to ask you a few questions regarding Mr. Ethan Carter." A chill shot through Sophia's veins. Her mind raced, her heart slamming in her chest. Why was the police calling? What had happened? What did they want with her? She sat up quickly, trying to steady her voice. "What is this about?" she asked, barely able to keep the panic from creeping into her tone. The detective's voice remained steady, unwavering. "There's been some developments. I understand you've been in contact with Mr. Carter recently, and we'd like to speak with you in person. Can you come down to the station today?" Her heart pounded in her chest. The image of Clara's voice whispering those chilling words flooded her mind. Was this connected? Was Ethan okay? I can come in," Sophia stammered, her throat dry. "Is Mr. Carter all right?" There was a pause, long enough to send a cold wave of panic through her. "I'll explain everything when you get here, Miss Sophia." The detective's voice was curt before the line went dead. Sophia sat there, frozen, the phone still pressed to her ear. Her mind spun in a chaotic blur. What had happened to Ethan? Was this related to the plot she overheard? Had Clara and Liam found out that she had warned him? The fear clawed at her stomach, tightening it into knots. With trembling hands, she quickly dressed, her thoughts racing. She couldn't focus on any one thing. Every moment felt urgent, her heart pounding as she made her way out of the building. The key in her pocket seemed heavier now, as if it carried all the weight of what was happening. Whatever was going on, it was far from over. The streets of the city, usually so familiar, now felt different, distant. The usual sounds of New York, the honking horns, the chatter, the constant hum of life were muffled, as if the world had subtly shifted, leaving her behind. She kept hearing the detective's voice replaying in her head. Something had happened to Ethan Carter. It wasn't just an ordinary call. There was a sense of urgency, of danger. She hadn't been expecting this, but now she had to face whatever was coming next. The police station's doors felt heavier than she imagined. As she entered, the fluorescent lights above buzzed softly, casting an unflattering, sterile glow over everything. The air smelled faintly of burnt coffee and paperwork, an atmosphere she'd never been in before, never even visited a police station. She walked cautiously toward the front desk, the sound of her footsteps too loud in the quiet. "Can I help you?" The officer at the desk barely glanced up, his tone indifferent. I'm here to see Detective Anderson, Sophia stammered, her voice shaking but steady enough to hide the fear she felt inside. The officer gave a quick nod, pointing to a set of double doors. Go through there, second office on the right. Her legs felt like lead as she passed through the doors, her body heavy with the weight of everything she had learned so far. She couldn't shake the worry. What if Clara had discovered she was the one who warned Ethan? What if Liam was involved too? When she reached the door, she knocked softly, her hand trembling just enough for her to notice. A moment passed before the door swung open, revealing a man in his late 40s, his expression serious but not unkind. He wore a simple suit, the kind that didn't demand attention. Miss Sophia? He asked, motioning her in. Sophia nodded and stepped into the small, cramped office, the walls stacked with files. Anderson gestured to a chair across from his desk. She sank into it, her hands gripping her purse strapped tightly in her lap. Thank you for coming in, Anderson said, settling behind the desk. He pulled out a folder, flipping through a few pages before finally looking up. I'm going to get right to it. Mr. Carter recently canceled a trip. From what I understand, you advised him to do so. Sophia swallowed hard. She had known this was coming, but hearing it spoken aloud felt like a punch to the gut. Yes, she said quietly, I overheard something, and I thought it was dangerous for him to go. Anderson's gaze sharpened, his eyes focusing intently on her. Can you tell me exactly what you overheard? Taking a deep breath, Sophia recounted the conversation she had overheard between Clara and Liam in the hotel room. She left nothing out, how they had planned to ensure Ethan's trip would be his last. The words rushed out of her, her heart pounding with each sentence, the weight of what she was revealing sinking deeper inside her. Anderson listened carefully, his expression unreadable, as he jotted down notes. When she finished, he leaned back in his chair, looking thoughtful. Mr. Carter canceled the trip, which seems to have saved his life, he said slowly. But there's more to it. We believe Mr. Carter has been investigating his wife for some time now, and what you overheard might only be the tip of the iceberg. Sophia blinked, trying to make sense of his words. Investigating his wife? She was stunned. What could that possibly mean? Anderson's face hardened slightly. Financial fraud, infidelity, and now attempted murder. Mr. Carter has been gathering evidence on Clara for a while, but it wasn't until he received your warning that he realized how serious things had become. He's been working with us closely ever since. The weight of his words crashed down on her like a tidal wave. Ethan knew? He'd known all along that something was wrong, and now with her warning it had all come into focus. She couldn't quite decide whether she felt relieved or terrified. Is he safe? Sophia asked, her voice barely a whisper, the fear suddenly flooding her again. Anderson hesitated, his expression briefly faltering before he spoke. For now, yes. He's under protective custody while we gather more evidence. But we need to move cautiously. Clara Carter isn't the kind of woman who'll back down easily, and her lover Liam is just as dangerous. Sophia nodded silently, her hand still clutching her purse. This was more than she ever expected. Betrayal, murder, fraud. Everything she had overheard was real, and she had been drawn into the middle of it all. She had always known the world of the wealthy was different, but this was something else entirely. Anderson watched her for a long moment before speaking again, his voice softer this time. I know this is a lot to take in. I'm sure you're scared, but you did the right thing by coming forward. Mr. Carter owes you his life. His words should have comforted her, but instead they only made her more anxious. She couldn't shake the thought, if Clara and Liam were willing to kill Ethan, what would they do to her if they found out she had been the one to warn him? Anderson stood up, signaling the end of their conversation. We're going to keep an eye on things. But if you notice anything suspicious, or if anyone contacts you, anything at all, you call me. We can't afford to take chances. Sophia nodded, rising from her chair. Her legs felt weak, as though the ground beneath her had shifted. Sophia stumbled out of the police station, her mind a whirlwind of everything Detective Anderson had told her. Protective custody, financial fraud, betrayal. It was too much to process. The walk back to her apartment felt like a blur. When she finally stepped inside, her body moved on autopilot. She locked the door behind her and leaned against it, trying to calm the storm of thoughts rushing through her mind. Anderson had said she'd done the right thing, but at what cost? Her phone buzzed again, cutting through the chaos in her head. She pulled it from her pocket, her breath catching when she saw the unfamiliar number. It wasn't a number she recognized, but something about it made her blood run cold. With shaky hands she answered. "Hello." There was a long pause, followed by the sound of soft breathing on the other end. Then the voice she dreaded. "Sophia," Clara's voice purred, sending an icy chill down Sophia's spine. "We need to talk." Sophia's stomach twisted. Her hand gripped the phone so tightly her knuckles turned white. How had Clara gotten her number? What did she want? "You think you're clever, don't you?" Clara continued, her voice now sharp and cold. "But you've made a huge mistake. People like you don't mess with people like me and get away with it. I'll make sure of that." The line went dead, leaving the threat hanging in the air like a dark cloud. Sophia stared at the phone, her heart pounding. She had known something like this was coming, but hearing it in such a calm, threatening tone made it all too real. Clara knew, and she wasn't going to let Sophia off the hook. Her hands were still trembling as she dropped the phone onto the counter. The dial tone still hummed in her ears, and the weight of Clara's words hung over her. What now? What was she supposed to do? Sophia paced the apartment, her mind racing. The space, which had felt like a dream just days ago, now seemed suffocating. Every corner, every shadow felt darker. Every sound from the hallway made her jump. She couldn't escape the feeling that Clara or Liam might be lurking, watching, waiting for the right moment to strike. She wanted to call Detective Anderson to tell him about the phone call. But what could the police do? They couldn't guard her 24/7. She wasn't ready to run, not yet. Not until she understood what her role in this twisted mess had become. Lost in her thoughts, a sharp knock on the door suddenly jolted her back to reality. Her heart skipped a beat. Who could that be? Was it Clara? Had she come for her already? She hesitated, hand hovering near the doorknob. After a tense moment, she peeked through the peephole. To her surprise, it wasn't Clara or Liam standing on the other side. It was Ethan. Her heart raced. She hadn't seen him since their brief exchange at the hotel. And now here he was, standing at her door, looking disheveled and tense. Without thinking, she unlocked the door and opened it. "Ethan," she breathed, her voice a mix of relief and confusion. "What are you doing here?" He stepped inside, his eyes quickly scanning the apartment before settling on her. He looked different from the polished businessman she'd seen at the hotel. His hair was messy, his suit wrinkled, and there was a raw intensity in his gaze that made her pulse quicken. "I needed to talk to you," he said, his voice low and urgent. "There's more to this than you know, Sophia. Much more." Sophia's mind was spinning. What could be worse than attempted murder and a web of lies? She closed the door behind him, bracing herself for whatever bombshell he was about to drop. "What do you mean?" she asked, her voice barely above a whisper. "What else could there be?" Ethan ran a hand through his hair, pacing the small living room. "After you warned me about Clara and Liam, I started digging deeper. I knew something was wrong, but I didn't realize how far back it all goes." He stopped, turning to face her, his expression dark. "It's about your father." Sophia's world seemed to stop. Her father. She hadn't thought about him in years. He had died when she was just a child, leaving her and her mother to survive on their own. But what could he have to do with any of this? "My father," she echoed, her voice trembling. "What does he have to do with any of this?" Ethan let out a slow sigh, his expression softening slightly, as if he was about to share something painful. "I didn't realize it until recently, but your father and I were close friends when we were kids. We grew up together. He was like a brother to me." Sophia's legs almost gave out beneath her. Her father had never mentioned Ethan, never talked about any childhood friends or connections from his past. It had always been just the two of them, her mother and her. They had barely scraped by, struggling to survive. This didn't make sense. "I don't understand," she whispered, her voice shaking. "My father died in an accident years ago. What does that have to do with Clara and Liam?" Ethan stepped closer to her, his expression filled with a mixture of guilt and determination. "That accident wasn't an accident, Sophia." Her breath caught in her throat. What do you mean? He looked at her with a heavy gaze. Your father got involved in something much bigger than you know. Something dangerous. And I think Clara had a hand in it. Sophia's knees felt weak, and she sank into the nearest chair, her mind reeling. The world she had known, the truth she'd accepted were all coming apart. Her father's death wasn't just some random tragedy. It was tied to this twisted web of lies and betrayal. I don't know all the details yet, Ethan continued, his voice quieter now. But I've found enough to know that your father was framed for something he didn't do. He got caught up in something with Clara's family years ago. Something that ultimately cost him his life. The weight of his words was crushing. Everything Sophia thought she knew about her father, about her life, was shifting beneath her. She had always believed her father's death was a tragic, random event. But now it seemed like a piece of a much darker puzzle. It all came crashing down in an instant. Sophia's mind was spinning. Her father framed, murdered, and now Clara, the very woman she had overheard plotting to kill Ethan, was somehow tangled up in her father's death. The world around her felt distant, blurry, as the weight of it all pressed down on her chest. Why didn't you tell me this sooner? She asked, her voice barely a whisper. Ethan's eyes darkened, a flash of guilt crossing his face. I wasn't sure, he said slowly. I needed more proof, and honestly I didn't want to drag you into this unless I had to. But now with Clara threatening you, I can't keep it from you any longer. You deserve to know the truth. Sophia's thoughts raced, trying to piece together the shattered fragments of her life. Her father had been connected to Ethan's world in ways she never could have imagined. And now here she was, caught in the middle of a conspiracy that had spanned decades. One that had taken her father's life and was now threatening her own. What do we do? She asked, her voice quiet but resolute. How do we stop her? Ethan's gaze hardened, and for the first time, she saw the true weight of the situation reflected in his eyes. We gather evidence. We expose her for everything she's done. He paused, his voice dropping to a low, dangerous tone. But it's going to take time. It's going to be dangerous. Clara's not playing games anymore. She's ruthless. And now that she knows you're involved, he didn't need to finish the sentence. Sophia understood the gravity of the threat hanging over her. Clara was coming for her, and she wasn't going to stop until she silenced her for good. The room fell into a heavy silence, the weight of their shared knowledge hanging in the air like a suffocating fog. Sophia's mind buzzed with a mixture of fear, anger, and determination. She had spent her entire life in the shadows, scraping by, never knowing that her past was so deeply entangled with secrets, deceit, and murder. But now those secrets were surfacing, and she had no choice but to face them head-on. I'm not going to run, Sophia said firmly, her voice gaining strength. If Clara is responsible for my father's death, I need to know the truth. And I need to make sure she pays for what she's done. Ethan nodded, a hint of admiration in his eyes. We'll do it together, Sophia. But we have to be careful. Clara's dangerous, and she's got people on her side who will do anything to protect her. A surge of strength ran through Sophia, a fire igniting inside her. She wasn't going to hide anymore. Not after everything she had learned. Her father had been taken from her, and now Clara was threatening to take even more from her. But Sophia wasn't going to let that happen. She wasn't invisible anymore. She was ready to fight. The days that followed Ethan's revelation were a whirlwind. Sophia couldn't focus on anything else. Her work at the hotel, her daily routines. Everything seemed so insignificant in comparison to the gravity of the truth she was slowly uncovering. She couldn't shake the feeling that her father's death wasn't an accident. She had always believed it was a cover-up, a murder disguised as a tragic accident. And now she had proof. Clara had a hand in it. But the biggest shock of all was realizing the connection between her family and Ethan Carter. Something that stretched back decades. She had grown up thinking she was just another faceless person in a world full of ordinary lives, struggling to get by. But now she realized her roots ran deeper than she'd ever known, tied to wealth and power she had never dreamed existed. Ethan had been distant since their last meeting. He sent occasional updates but mostly kept a low profile. The police investigation was ongoing, and he was working closely with Detective Anderson to build a case against Clara. But the process was slow, fraught with complications. Each day that passed felt like another day. Clara was getting closer to Sophia. As she sat in her new apartment, staring out at the glittering New York skyline, she felt the walls closing in. The luxury that had once seemed like a dream now felt like a gilded cage, trapping her in a world she barely understood. She was safe for now, but she knew it wouldn't last. Clara had found her once. She could find her again. Then the knock on the door startled her out of her thoughts. Her heart raced, fear gripping her. Was it Clara's men? Or worse, Clara herself? She hesitated, hand hovering near the doorknob, her mind racing. After a long moment she opened the door, and to her surprise it wasn't Clara or anyone from her team. It was Detective Anderson. His expression was grim, and Sophia knew immediately that something had happened. "Can I come in?" he asked, his voice calm but serious. Sophia nodded, stepping aside to let him in. The tension in the room was palpable as Anderson scanned the apartment, his eyes darting over every corner as if making sure they were alone. "We've uncovered more information about your father," Anderson began, his tone measured. "I know this has been difficult for you, but I need you to hear everything. Are you ready for that?" Sophia's throat tightened. She wasn't sure she was ready, but she knew she had no choice. She had to face the truth, no matter how painful it might be. "Tell me," she said softly. Anderson pulled out a folder from his briefcase and laid it on the table between them. He opened it to reveal documents, photographs, and police reports, all related to her father. Sophia's stomach churned as she glanced at the pages, her mind struggling to absorb the weight of what they contained. "Your father, David, wasn't just an ordinary man," Anderson continued. "He had ties to some very powerful people. People who operated in the shadows, using their wealth and influence to control those around them. One of those people was Clara's father." Sophia's heart sank. She had suspected Clara's connection to all of this, but hearing it spoken aloud made it all the more real, more terrifying. "What happened to him?" Sophia asked, her voice barely audible. Anderson sighed, flipping through the documents. "David got involved in something he couldn't escape. He was framed for embezzling money from Clara's father's company, but the truth is he was set up. He knew too much about their illegal dealings, and they needed a way to get rid of him without raising suspicion." Sophia's mind raced as Anderson continued. "The car accident that killed your father wasn't an accident. It was orchestrated by Clara's family to silence him before he could expose their crimes. He was a threat to them, and they dealt with him in the only way they knew how." The room seemed to close in on Sophia. She could barely breathe, her chest tight as the full weight of Anderson's words settled in. Everything she had believed about her father's death, the tragic accident, was a lie. The truth was darker, deeper, and far more dangerous than she could have ever imagined. Her father hadn't been murdered because of something he'd done. He'd been killed because he was trying to do the right thing. Sophia's mind raced, the realization hitting her like a physical blow. He'd been silenced. And now Clara, the woman she'd overheard plotting Ethan's murder, was connected to her father's death. Everything she thought she knew about her life was unraveling, thread by thread. "Why didn't anyone tell me?" Sophia's voice cracked as she spoke, barely above a whisper. She could feel the tears threatening to spill, but she held them back. "Why didn't I know about any of this?" Anderson's expression softened, his eyes heavy with sympathy. "They made sure you wouldn't know," he said quietly. "After your father died, they covered their tracks. They erased everything. You and your mother were left to believe it was a tragic accident, and nothing more." Her fists clenched, the anger and the frustration boiling over. All these years she had believed in a lie, and now the truth, the painful, ugly truth, was worse than she could have ever imagined. "I've been working to uncover more," Anderson continued. "But Clara's family has always been one step ahead. Their power and influence run deep. We've only scratched the surface, thanks to what's happening with Ethan. His digging into the past is bringing up things that they thought were buried forever." Sophia took a shaky breath, trying to regain some control. "What do I do now?" she wondered. "How do we stop her?" Anderson met her gaze, his eyes hard with resolve. "We need concrete proof," he said, his voice firm. "Something that ties Clara directly to your father's death. Without it, she'll just keep getting away with everything." Her thoughts raced. Proof. She had to find it, The odds seemed overwhelming. She was just an ordinary woman, standing against someone with that kind of power. But the fire inside her, the urge to see justice done, burned too brightly for her to turn back. She wasn't going to let Clara win. "There's something else," Anderson said, his voice lowering as he seemed to wrestle with the weight of what he was about to say. "Ethan has found something. Something big." Sophia's stomach churned. "What? What did he find?" Anderson leaned in, his tone serious. "Ethan has been looking into your past, too. And he's uncovered something you never knew. You're the rightful heir to a portion of your father's estate. A portion of the wealth that was stolen from your family when Clara's father framed him." The words felt like a punch. Sophia couldn't comprehend what she was hearing. "What?" Anderson nodded, confirming what felt impossible. "You're not just connected to Ethan through your father's friendship. You're legally entitled to a significant amount of money. Money that Clara's family has kept hidden for years." The world seemed to tilt beneath her. She had spent her life working tirelessly, struggling to get by, never once considering that there could be wealth tied to her name. And now, out of nowhere, it was dropped in her lap, this shocking inheritance, a legacy she had never known about. "That's why Clara is so desperate to silence you," Anderson explained, his voice low and serious. "If you claim what's yours, if you find out the truth, her entire empire is at risk." Sophia leaned back, trying to wrap her mind around the sheer scale of everything. The pieces of the puzzle were slowly falling into place, but the picture they created was darker than she ever imagined. She wasn't just a bystander in Clara's twisted game. She was a threat to everything Clara had worked to build. "I don't care about the money," Sophia said, her voice clear, a note of finality in it. "I just want justice for my father." Anderson looked at her with respect. "I admire that. We'll get it. But you need to stay vigilant. Clara won't stop until she's sure you can't expose her." Sophia's heart thundered in her chest. She had already been pulled into this world deeper than she ever expected. But now there was no turning back. Clara had stolen everything from her. Her father's life, her family's legacy. And now she wanted to take Sophia's life too. But Sophia wasn't going to let her. "I'll do whatever it takes," she said, her voice firm with resolve. "Clara can't win." The following days were a blur of uncertainty and fear. Sophia couldn't focus on anything else. The weight of the truth about her father, Clara's ruthless pursuit, and the discovery of her father's hidden wealth consumed her thoughts. She barely left the apartment, paralyzed by the enormity of what she had learned. Every time her phone buzzed or she heard footsteps outside her door, her heart would race, fearful that Clara or her associates were closing in. But as the days passed, Sophia found something inside her changing. The fear was still there, lurking in the background, but it no longer ruled her. Now there was something stronger: determination. Clara had underestimated her. Sophia wasn't going to be a victim anymore. 4 days later, Sophia's phone rang. Ethan's name flashed across the screen, and the urgency in his voice was unmistakable when she answered. "We need to talk. I found something." Her pulse quickened. "What did you find?" she asked without hesitation. They agreed to meet at a quiet cafe on the Upper East Side, a place far from the chaos of the hotel and the looming threat of Wilshire Towers. Sophia was determined not to draw attention, especially not from Clara. She couldn't risk the possibility of Clara finding out they were working together. When she arrived at the cafe, Ethan was already there, sitting alone at a small table in the corner. He looked worn out, exhaustion lining his face. The composed businessman she had seen so many times was now a shadow of himself, his appearance raw and unguarded. "Thanks for coming," he said, his voice heavy. "Of course," Sophia replied, trying to maintain her calm. "What did you find?" Ethan leaned in closer, his voice dropping low. "I've been digging through Clara's father's records. There's more going on here than we thought. This isn't just about your father's death. This goes much deeper. Clara's family has been involved in illegal business dealings for years, some of which led directly to the collapse of several companies, including the one your father worked for." Sophia's skin prickled with cold. "What does that mean? How does it connect to my father?" Ethan hesitated, his eyes flickering with concern. "Your father wasn't just framed for embezzling. He was going to expose everything. He was going to blow the whistle on Clara's family's crimes. They couldn't let that happen, so they set him up. And when he didn't go quietly, they made sure he wouldn't have the chance to talk. Sophia's breath caught in her throat. Her father had been trying to stop them. He had been trying to protect people from Clara's family's corruption, and they had killed him for it. The weight of that truth crushed her. The pain was unbearable. "I can't believe this," Sophia whispered, her hands trembling. "I thought it was just an accident. Just a random tragedy." Ethan reached across the table, gently placing his hand over hers. "I know this is hard to hear, but you need to understand, Sophia. They won't stop. Clara will do whatever it takes to protect her family's secrets. And now that she knows you're a threat, she'll come after you with everything she has." Sophia nodded, trying to steady her breath. She had known the stakes were high, but hearing everything so plainly laid out made the danger feel far more immediate. Clara wasn't just trying to silence her. She was desperately trying to protect a legacy of corruption, one that had already cost Sophia's father his life. And now Sophia was standing in the way of all of it. "I'm not going to let her win," Sophia said, her voice firm, conviction replacing the fear that had gripped her. "I don't care what it takes. She can't get away with this." Ethan squeezed her hand, his expression filled with admiration but also a sense of urgency. "You're stronger than you know, Sophia. But we have to be careful. We don't have enough evidence to bring her down yet. We need something concrete. Something that ties her directly to your father's death and the illegal activities." Sophia's mind raced, trying to keep up. "What about Liam? He's involved too. If we can get him to turn, maybe he'll give us the missing piece." Ethan nodded thoughtfully. "I've been considering that. Liam's loyalty to Clara is shaky at best. He's in this for the money, not for her. If we make him believe that siding with us is his best option, he might be willing to talk." A surge of hope rose in Sophia's chest. It was a risky plan, but it felt like the best chance they had. "How do we get to him?" she asked, her voice laced with cautious optimism. Ethan leaned back in his chair, his brow furrowed as he thought it through. "I've been keeping tabs on him. He's a regular at a bar downtown. It's quiet. No one from Clara's circle would be caught dead there. I think it's his escape from the pressure of her world." Sophia's heart skipped a beat. The idea of confronting Liam, the man tied to her father's death, terrified her. But if they could get him to crack, it could be the breakthrough they needed. "We need to move fast," she said, determination edging her tone. "Clara is already on to me. She called me the other day. Threatened me." Ethan's eyes widened in alarm. "She called you? What did she say?" "She said I made a big mistake," Sophia replied, her voice trembling slightly as she relived the chilling words. "That people like me don't mess with people like her and get away with it." Ethan's jaw tightened, his anger barely contained. "She's not going to get away with this. We'll make sure of that." Sophia nodded, the resolve settling deeper in her chest. They had to act quickly before Clara tightened her grip on the situation. Time was running out, and every moment they wasted brought Clara closer to achieving her goal. They finished their meeting, agreeing to meet at the bar later that night. As Sophia walked out of the cafe, she felt the weight of the decision pressing on her. This was it, the moment they had been working toward. If they could get Liam to talk, they might finally be able to take Clara down. But if they failed, the consequences didn't bear thinking about. That evening, Sophia met Ethan outside the bar. Her nerves were on edge. The neon lights flickered above them, casting a dull glow over the cracked sidewalk. The bar itself was nothing special. It blended in with the background noise of New York's nightlife, unremarkable and worn. But tonight, it felt like the most important place in the world. "You ready for this?" Ethan asked, his voice steady but tinged with tension. Sophia nodded, though her stomach was in knots. "As ready as I'll ever be." Together, they entered the bar, the low murmur of voices and the dim lighting immediately enveloping them. The smell of stale beer and cigarette smoke was a stark contrast to the polished environments they were used to, but it felt fitting, dangerous in a way that matched the situation. Liam was there, just as Ethan had predicted. He sat alone at the far end of the bar, his attention fixed on the drink in front of him. He didn't notice them approach. Sophia's heart pounded as she and Ethan made their way to him. When they reached his side, Ethan spoke first. Liam. Liam looked up, his eyes flashing with surprise. For a brief moment he looked like he might bolt, but Ethan quickly slid into the seat next to him, blocking any chance of escape. We need to talk, Ethan said, his voice low and firm, no room for negotiation. Liam's gaze darted between them, suspicion creeping across his face. What's this about? Sophia leaned in, her voice steady despite the nerves twisting in her stomach. It's about Clara. We know everything. Liam's eyes narrowed, but there was a flicker of something else there. Fear. Uncertainty. He didn't respond, waiting for them to continue. You're in deep, Liam, Ethan said, his tone cutting through the thick tension. But it doesn't have to end badly for you if you cooperate with us. We can protect you. But you need to help us bring Clara down. Liam's jaw clenched, his eyes darting around the room, as if to check if anyone was watching. Sophia could see the internal struggle unfolding on his face. He wasn't loyal to Clara. He was loyal to the money, the lifestyle. If he thought siding with them would protect him, there was a good chance he'd talk. You don't know what she's capable of, Liam muttered, his voice low. Sophia leaned in closer, her voice soft but insistent. I know she killed my father. I know she'll do anything to protect herself. But you don't have to go down with her, Liam. You can walk away from this. For a long moment Liam didn't speak. The silence stretched between them, thick with tension, until he finally sighed, his shoulders slumping in defeat. All right, he said quietly. I'll tell you what you need to know. His confession came in whispers, almost subdued, but the impact was immediate. Sophia felt as if the ground had shifted beneath her, as if the full weight of Clara's crimes had just crashed down on them. Liam glanced nervously around the room, as though expecting Clara to walk in at any moment. You don't get it, he said, his voice trembling slightly. Clara doesn't just protect herself. She erases problems. People who cross her don't just disappear. They're destroyed. Sophia swallowed hard, her voice barely a whisper. What do you mean? Liam rubbed a hand over his face. She's ruthless. Her father taught her everything. They've been running scams, backdoor deals for years, all under the radar. And when someone threatens to expose them, they make sure that person isn't around to cause trouble. Sophia's stomach turned. Your father. He wasn't the first. Ethan clenched his jaw, anger flickering in his eyes. And you were okay with that? He asked, his voice low and controlled. You were okay with helping her cover up murder? Liam flinched, guilt flashing across his face. I didn't know how far it went at first, he said, his voice shaking. I thought it was just about the money. But once I was in, there was no way out. Clara made sure of that. Sophia stared at him, a sickening mixture of anger and pity swirling inside her. He was weak, and yet at least he was talking now. But she couldn't let her emotions cloud the mission. They were so close. The truth was finally within reach. You need to give us something we can use against her, Sophia said, her voice firm, though her nerves were on edge. Something solid. Something that ties her directly to my father's death. Liam glanced around the bar, his eyes flicking nervously to the shadows before he spoke. There are files, he said, lowering his voice. Clara's kept records of everything. How she controls people, blackmail, leverage. If you get those files, you can bury her. Where are they? Ethan asked, leaning in closer, his voice low and intense. Liam hesitated, his eyes darting around as though to ensure no one was listening. She keeps them in a safe at her family's estate upstate. No one goes there anymore. Except her. The place is practically abandoned, but she still uses it to hide anything she doesn't want anyone finding. Sophia's heart skipped a beat. This was it. The break they needed. If they could get their hands on those files, they would have everything needed to bring Clara down. For her father's death, the fraud, everything. Can you get us in? Ethan asked, his voice calm but full of urgency. Liam shook his head quickly. No way. If she suspects I'm involved, I'm dead. But the estate isn't heavily guarded. Clara thinks no one knows about it. If you're careful, you can get in without anyone noticing. Ethan nodded, already formulating a plan. We'll handle it. But you need to stay out of sight. If Clara finds out you flipped, she'll come after you too. Liam didn't argue. He looked like a man on the edge, barely holding it together. Sophia wondered deep down if he regretted ever getting tangled up with Clara in the first place. But now wasn't the time for sympathy. There was a mission to complete. After leaving the bar, Sophia and Ethan walked down the street in silence, the weight of what they were about to do settling between them like a storm cloud. The air was cool, biting, and the night felt too still, as though everything in the world had stopped, waiting for the inevitable confrontation. Breaking into Clara's family estate was dangerous. If they were caught, there was no telling what Clara might do. But it was the only way to end this. Sophia's pulse quickened as she thought of her father, of the files, of everything that hung in the balance. "We have to be smart about this," Ethan said, breaking the silence, his voice quiet but firm. "If we go in unprepared, we're done." Sophia nodded, though her nerves were frayed. "I know, but we can't wait. The longer we wait, the more time Clara has to figure out we're onto her. We need to act fast." Ethan stopped walking, turning to face her. His gaze was intense, filled with both concern and determination. "Sophia, I don't want you anywhere near that estate. It's too dangerous." Sophia bristled at his words, shaking her head firmly. "I'm not staying behind, Ethan. This is about my father. I deserve to be there." Ethan opened his mouth to protest, but one look at her face made him realize it was no use. Sophia wasn't backing down. She had come too far, learned too much, and there was no way she was going to sit on the sidelines now. "All right," he said, his voice softening. "But we do this carefully. No risks. If anything feels off, we pull back." Sophia nodded, though deep down, she knew that pulling back wasn't an option for her. Not when they were so close to bringing Clara to justice. The drive to Clara's family estate the next evening was tense, the silence between them heavy with anticipation. The estate was a long way from the city, tucked away in the rolling hills of upstate New York. The sun had long set by the time they pulled up to the long winding driveway, the silhouette of the mansion looming in the distance like a ghost in the dark. The estate was just as Liam had described. Abandoned but imposing. The old mansion sat at the end of the driveway, its iron gate slightly ajar as though no one had cared to lock it properly in years. Overgrown vines crept up the stone walls, and the windows were dark, giving the place an eerie, forgotten aura. Ethan parked the car a good distance from the gates, cutting the engine as they sat in the quiet darkness, scanning the area for signs of life. But the estate was silent. No guards, no cameras in sight. "Are you ready?" Ethan asked, his voice low, eyes scanning the surroundings. Sophia nodded, her heart pounding in her chest. "Let's do this." They slipped out of the car, keeping low, moving quickly but quietly as they approached the gates. The night was cold, still, and the sound of their footsteps felt like a betrayal in the quiet of the estate. Every rustle of leaves or snap of a twig made Sophia flinch, but she pushed forward. There was no turning back now. The gates creaked as they pushed them open, but the sound was swallowed by the vastness of the estate. The mansion loomed ahead, its darkened windows like empty eyes watching their every move. Sophia couldn't shake the feeling that they were being watched, even though the place seemed deserted. Once inside the gates, they moved swiftly, staying close to the shadows as they made their way toward the back of the mansion. Liam had given them precise instructions on where to find the safe, hidden in a small study on the second floor, behind a panel in the wall. It wouldn't be easy, but it was their only shot. They entered through a side door that had been left unlocked. The old hinges groaned in protest as they slipped inside. The interior was just as eerie as the outside. Dark, cold, and silent. Dust coated the furniture, and a faint smell of mildew lingered in the air. It was clear no one had been here in a long time. Sophia's heart raced as they made their way down the hallways, the floor creaking beneath their feet. Every shadow seemed to shift, and every gust of wind through the cracked windows felt like a warning. But they pressed on, deeper into the mansion, toward the study. When they reached the study, Ethan immediately set to work, searching for the hidden panel Liam had described. Sophia stood by the door, her senses heightened, listening for any sign of movement. Her pulse thundered in her ears, each second stretching into eternity. "There," Ethan whispered, his fingers finding the hidden latch. The panel slid open with a soft click, revealing a small steel safe embedded in the wall. Sophia's heart skipped a beat. This was it, the files that could finally take Clara down. But just as Ethan began to work on the safe, The faint sound of footsteps echoed down the hall. Sophia froze, her blood turning to ice. Someone was coming. "Ethan," she whispered urgently, eyes wide with fear. "Someone's coming." Ethan cursed under his breath, his hands moving faster as he worked to crack the safe. The footsteps grew louder, closer. They were running out of time. Finally, with a soft click, the safe door swung open. Ethan grabbed the files inside, shoving them into his bag just as the footsteps stopped outside the study door. "We need to go," Sophia hissed, her voice barely audible. But before they could move, the door creaked open. And there she stood, Clara. Her eyes were cold, calculating, and her cruel smile sent a chill down Sophia's spine. "Well, well," Clara said, her voice dripping with venom. "Looks like the little maid finally learned how to play." Sophia's breath caught in her throat as Clara's gaze fixed on her, the smug smile never faltering. The confrontation they had feared was finally here. The room seemed to shrink around them, the walls closing in with every passing second. Shadows loomed larger, and every exit felt blocked. Sophia had prepared herself for this moment for so long, but nothing could have prepared her for the cold, suffocating reality of facing Clara here, in this darkened mansion. No one around to help. No way out. Ethan stood frozen by the safe, the files clutched tightly in his hands. The tension in the air was so thick it could have been sliced with a knife. Clara wasn't just surprised, she had expected this. She always seemed to be a step ahead. "Well, I have to say I'm impressed," Clara purred, her voice smooth, almost mocking as she stepped further into the room. "I knew you were getting bold, Sophia, but I didn't think you had it in you to break into my family's estate." Sophia's pulse quickened, every instinct telling her to run, but there was no way out. Clara blocked the door, and behind her, a shadow moved, Liam lurking just out of sight. He had betrayed them. Of course he had. The moment they'd left the bar, he must have gone straight to Clara. Ethan took a step forward, his expression hardening with barely contained anger. "This ends here, Clara. We have the evidence. Your lies, your crimes, they're all coming out." Clara's lips curled into a low, mocking laugh. "Oh, Ethan," she cooed, shaking her head slightly, as if she were speaking to a child. "You always had such a naive view of the world. Do you really think a few old papers are enough to stop me? I've been playing this game for years. You think I'm going to let a couple of nobodies like you take me down?" Sophia's hands clenched into fists, fury rising in her chest. "You killed my father," she said, her voice steady but filled with a quiet rage. "And now you're going to pay for it." For a brief moment, Clara's smile faltered. Something cold and dangerous flickered across her face, and Sophia knew they had struck a nerve. "Your father was a fool," Clara spat, her voice suddenly sharp. "He thought he could outsmart my family. He thought he could expose us, take us down. But we handled him just like I'm going to handle you." Before either Sophia or Ethan could react, Clara snapped her fingers, and Liam stepped into the room. His face was expressionless, his eyes betraying a flicker of regret, but the gun in his hand was unmistakable. Sophia's heart sank. "I didn't want it to come to this," Liam muttered, his voice low, almost apologetic. "But Clara, she doesn't leave loose ends." Ethan tensed beside Sophia, his gaze flickering between Liam and Clara. He wasn't stupid. He knew this was about survival. "You don't have to do this, Liam," Ethan said, his voice calm but firm. "You can walk away from this. We can protect you." Liam's eyes flicked toward Clara, his hesitation barely noticeable but telling. Sophia saw it, the brief flicker of doubt, the indecision in his gaze. He wasn't a killer. Not really. He was just as trapped as they were. But Clara stepped closer to him, her voice thick with venom. "Liam, if you don't take care of this, I will. And believe me, it'll be a lot messier if I do." Liam's grip on the gun tightened, his jaw clenched in fear. Sophia's breath caught in her throat as she fought to think of something, anything, that could get them out of this alive. "Liam," she said softly, her voice steady despite the shaking in her hands. "You don't have to do this. She's using you. If you go through with this, you'll never be free of her." Clara's eyes narrowed dangerously, but Sophia pressed on, taking a small step toward Liam, her voice firm and unwavering. "If you pull that trigger, your life will always belong to her. But if you help us, you can walk away. You can start over." For a long moment the room was silent. Sophia's heart thundered in her chest, and her breath seemed to catch in her throat. Liam's gaze flicked between her and Clara, torn between fear and a glimmer of hope. Clara, sensing his hesitation, stepped closer, her voice low and deadly. "Liam, don't be stupid. You know what I'll do to you if you don't handle this." Liam's hand wavered, the gun shaking ever so slightly. Sophia held her breath, praying he would make the right choice. And then something shifted in his eyes. The hardness faded, the resolve cracked, and the gun lowered. "I'm sorry," Liam whispered, his voice barely audible. Clara's face twisted with rage. "You coward," she hissed, lunging toward him. But Ethan was faster. In a fluid motion he stepped between Clara and Liam, grabbing her arm and twisting it behind her back with swift precision. Clara let out a furious scream, but Ethan held her firmly, his grip unyielding. "Liam, get the gun," Ethan barked, and without hesitation, Liam bent down, retrieving the weapon from the floor. Sophia's heart pounded in her chest as they began to secure Clara, the files now safely in their possession. They had everything they needed, proof, the files, Clara cornered, but a sudden realization struck Sophia. This wasn't just about taking Clara down. It was about justice for her father, for the years she had lost, for the life that had been stolen from her. Clara struggled in Ethan's grip, her face twisted with fury. "You think this is over?" she spat, her voice dripping with venom. "You think you've won?" Ethan's eyes were cold as he tightened his hold on her. "It's over, Clara." But Clara's smile slowly returned, slow and dangerous. "You're a fool, Ethan. You've always been a fool. You really think I don't have a plan for this?" Sophia's heart sank as Clara's words hit her like a slap. Of course Clara had a plan. She always did. She wasn't the type to go down without a fight. Suddenly, the sound of approaching footsteps echoed down the hall, and Sophia's stomach twisted. More of Clara's people. They were out of time. "We need to get out of here now," Liam urged, his voice shaking. Ethan nodded, pulling Clara toward the door. Sophia felt the panic rising in her chest. They had the evidence, but they still had to make it out alive. Clara's laughter echoed behind them, cruel and full of malice. "You're all dead," she sneered. "You don't even realize it yet." But Sophia wasn't ready to give up. Not now. Not when they were so close. She had fought too hard to let Clara win. "We have to make it out," Sophia whispered, the words a prayer and a plea. As they reached the front door, the sounds of footsteps grew louder, closer. Ethan glanced at Sophia, his expression resolute. "Stay close," he said, his voice firm. "We're going to make it." Sophia nodded, her pulse pounding in her ears. She couldn't afford to be afraid now. Not when everything was on the line. With one last glance back at the looming mansion, they burst through the front door, the cold night air hitting them like a jolt of life. But their relief was short-lived. A group of men, Clara's hired thugs, appeared at the far end of the driveway, guns in hand, their eyes locked on Sophia, Ethan and Liam. "We have to run," Sophia gasped, her legs already burning with effort. Ethan nodded, his grip tightening on Clara as they sprinted toward the car. The men shouted after them, but they didn't stop. They couldn't stop. And just as they reached the car, gunfire rang out. The deafening crack split the air around them. Sophia ducked instinctively, her heart racing as she threw herself into the passenger seat. Ethan shoved Clara into the back seat, slamming the door behind her as bullets ricocheted off the car's metal frame. "Go, go, go," Ethan shouted, his voice taut with panic, as Liam slammed his foot down on the gas pedal. The car lurched forward, tearing down the long driveway, leaving the estate and the danger far behind. Sophia's breath came in shallow, jagged gasps as she stole a glance back at the mansion, disappearing into the night behind them. The men chasing them were still firing, the shots echoing into the darkness, but they were already too far away to catch up. They had escaped just barely. Clara sat in the back seat, her wrists bound tightly with a piece of rope Ethan had grabbed from the car. Despite the restraint, her eyes burned with unrelenting fury, her lips curling into a sneer. But Sophia didn't care. They had her now. They had everything. "We did it," Sophia whispered, her voice barely audible over the roar of the engine. Ethan nodded, his eyes locked on the road ahead. "It's over. We've got her." But as they sped away into the night, a cold feeling gnawed at the back of Sophia's mind. This wasn't over. Clara's chilling words echoed in her head, like a lingering shadow. You're all dead. You don't even realize it yet. The car rumbled down the dark highway, the steady hum of the tires barely cutting through the tension in the air. Clara sat silently behind them, her gaze burning into the back of Sophia's head. The silence between them was suffocating, broken only by the occasional exhale and the engine's relentless rhythm. Sophia couldn't relax. The adrenaline was still coursing through her veins, making her every nerve feel on edge. They had Clara, they had the files, but she couldn't shake the feeling that something was wrong. They still had to get the evidence to the police. They had to make sure Clara faced justice for everything she had done. Liam, who had been silent since they fled the estate, finally spoke from the driver's seat. What now? His voice was tight, filled with uncertainty. Ethan leaned forward, his jaw set, determination filling his eyes. We take Clara and these files to Detective Anderson. We have everything we need to bring her down now. Clara's laughter sliced through the air like a blade. You really think this is over? She sneered, her voice dripping with venom. You're playing a game you don't understand, Ethan. My family has been at this for years. You think a few documents are enough to take us down? You're delusional. Ethan shot her a cold look through the rearview mirror, his voice unwavering. You're done, Clara. This time you don't get to talk your way out of it. Clara leaned back against the seat, her smile dark and unsettling. We'll see about that. Sophia felt a knot tighten in her stomach at Clara's words. Even in defeat, she exuded a dangerous confidence. There was something unsettling about her demeanor, like she still had one more card to play that they didn't see coming. Sophia glanced at Ethan. His jaw was clenched, eyes filled with grim resolve, and then to Liam, whose gaze was fixed firmly on the road, clearly trying to avoid the tension simmering in the car. The hours stretched on as they neared the city, the anxiety building with every passing mile. Sophia kept thinking about her father, about the life he'd lost, about everything Clara's family had taken from her. And now, after all these years, the truth was finally within reach. But there was no denying the risk. Clara's family was powerful, and they wouldn't let this go quietly. As the city's lights started to flicker in the distance, Sophia's phone buzzed in her lap. It was Detective Anderson. She answered quickly, her voice shaky but urgent. Detective, it's Sophia. We've got her. We have Clara and we've got the files. There was a brief pause on the other end before Anderson's calm voice came through. Good work, Sophia. Where are you? We're about 20 minutes outside the city, Sophia replied. We're heading to the station now. Anderson's tone shifted slightly, urgency creeping in. Don't go to the station. Take her to a secure location. We'll meet you there. Sophia's brow furrowed. Why? What's going on? Anderson hesitated for a beat before responding. Clara's family has powerful connections, Sophia. We've already had a few leaks within the department. We can't risk bringing her in through the front door. Just trust me. Take her to the warehouse on 8th Avenue. It's safe. I'll have officers waiting there. Sophia exchanged a quick glance with Ethan, who had been listening to the conversation. He gave a slight nod, indicating they should follow Anderson's instructions. Okay, Sophia said into the phone. We'll head to the warehouse. As she hung up, she noticed Clara's smile had widened ever so slightly. It was subtle, but it sent a chill down Sophia's spine. It was as if Clara knew something they didn't. Liam took a sharp turn off the highway, heading toward the city's industrial district. The streets grew quieter, darker, the area unfamiliar to Sophia. Mostly abandoned buildings and long-forgotten factories. The warehouse loomed ahead, a massive shadowy structure at the end of a narrow street. As they pulled up to the entrance, Sophia's nerves spiked. Something felt wrong. There were no police cars, no officers waiting for them. Just the empty, cold lot in front of the warehouse. We're here, Liam muttered, killing the engine. The car sat in silence for a moment, all three of them staring at the dark, foreboding building. Ethan was the first to speak. Stay sharp, he said in a low voice. Something feels off. They got out of the car cautiously, Clara's eyes following their every move, that unsettling smile still frozen on her face. Sophia's heart raced as they approached the warehouse door, every instinct screaming at her to turn back. But it was too late. They were in too deep. As they stepped inside, the echo of their footsteps rang out in the vast empty space. The warehouse was dimly lit, with only a few flickering bulbs casting eerie shadows across the floor. Sophia's pulse quickened. It was too quiet. Suddenly, the door behind them slammed shut with a deafening bang. Sophia spun around, her heart leaping into her throat. 3 men stood at the entrance, guns drawn, their faces cold and expressionless. Sophia's stomach dropped. Clara's men. I told you. Clara's voice rang out, smooth and triumphant. You don't understand the game. Ethan's jaw clenched, his eyes narrowing as he stepped protectively in front of Sophia. What is this? He demanded. Clara shrugged nonchalantly, as if this were all part of her grand plan. This is the part where you lose, Ethan. One of the men stepped forward, gun aimed directly at Ethan. Hand over the files, he ordered, his voice cold and mechanical. Sophia's mind raced. They were trapped. There was no way out. Panic surged in her chest, but she forced herself to stay calm. She had come too far to let Clara win now. Ethan, ever composed, tightened his grip on the bag containing the files. You're not getting these, he said, his voice steady but resolute. The man cocked his gun, the sound of it clicking into place sending a cold shiver down Sophia's spine. I won't ask again. For a moment it felt as if everything hung in the balance. The tension in the air was so thick it almost felt suffocating. Sophia's heartbeat echoed in her ears, and she stood frozen, waiting for something, anything to break the deadlock. Then from out of the shadows, a voice sliced through the silence. Lower your weapons. Sophia spun around, her heart leaping into her throat. It was Anderson, flanked by several officers, their guns aimed squarely at Clara's men. A rush of relief washed over Sophia, but she knew the situation was far from secure. Anderson moved forward, his gaze locking on Clara. It's over, he said with calm finality. You're finished. Clara's smile faltered, just for a brief second, but it was enough to spark a flicker of hope in Sophia's chest. With swift precision, Anderson's officers moved in, disarming Clara's men and securing the crucial files. The weight of the past few days hit Sophia all at once, making her legs feel like jelly, but she held herself upright. She watched as Anderson stepped toward Clara, handcuffs in hand. You've lost, Clara, Anderson said coldly, snapping the cuffs on her wrists. You're going to pay for everything. Clara's face contorted with rage, but she remained silent as Anderson led her away. The men who had worked for Clara were taken into custody, their faces grim and resigned. Sophia stood there, numb, watching as they were escorted out. It was finally over. All the lies, the danger, the constant fear, it had all led to this moment. Clara was going to face justice. But instead of feeling victorious, Sophia felt an emptiness settle over her. Ethan placed a gentle hand on her shoulder, grounding her in the moment. You did it, he said softly. It's over. Sophia nodded, though the weight of it all hadn't quite sunk in yet. She had fought for this moment. Fought for her father, fought for herself, and now it was here. But it felt strangely hollow, as if something was still missing. As the officers finished up, Anderson approached her, his expression softening. You did well, Sophia, he said. Your father would be proud. The words hit her harder than she expected. For the first time in days, she allowed herself to feel the enormity of it all. Tears welled up in her eyes, but they weren't just tears of sadness. They were tears of relief, of closure. Her father's legacy had been restored, and Clara would answer for her crimes. Sophia could finally begin to move on. But as she wiped the tears from her eyes and gazed out at the city, the dark skyline beyond the warehouse, a thought tugged at her. What would her life be like now? The fight was over, but a new chapter was about to begin. The next few days passed in a blur. News of Clara's arrest spread like wildfire, splashed across the city's gossip columns. Yet, the headlines barely scratched the surface of the intricate web of corruption, fraud, and murder that Sophia had uncovered. It felt strange seeing her own life exposed in the papers, what had once been her private nightmare now a public spectacle. But Clara was in custody, and Liam had turned state's witness, agreeing to cooperate in exchange for leniency. The files that Ethan and Sophia had recovered from the estate were enough to completely dismantle Clara and her family's criminal empire. Detective Anderson reassured Sophia that it was just a matter of time before Clara would be formally charged with murder, conspiracy, and numerous other crimes. Sophia felt a sense of relief, but something inside her still felt empty. There was an unsettling feeling that something wasn't quite finished. She had spent so much time fighting and searching for justice, but now, with everything seemingly resolved, she hadn't given much thought to what came after. Now that the battle was won, she was left with her own thoughts, her memories, and the uncertainty of a future she hadn't prepared for. She sat in her new apartment, staring out at the city skyline. The sunset bathed the buildings in a golden glow, but Sophia felt oddly detached. The luxury of it all, something she had once dreamed of, now seemed more like a reminder of just how much her life had changed. She had inherited a fortune. Her father's name had been cleared, and Clara was finally going to face justice for her crimes. But what did any of that really mean for Sophia? A knock at the door broke her thoughts. She opened it to find Ethan standing there, a gentle smile on his face. "Mind if I come in?" he asked. Sophia stepped aside, allowing him in. He walked over to the window, his eyes scanning the city below before turning back to her. "How are you holding up?" he asked softly, his voice full of concern. Sophia gave a shrug and sank into the couch. "I don't know," she confessed. "I should feel happy, I guess, but I don't know if I do." Ethan sat beside her, offering comfort with his presence. "It makes sense," he said. "You've spent so long fighting for justice, and now that it's over, it's hard to know what comes next." Sophia nodded, feeling the weight of his words. "Yeah, exactly. I've been so focused on the past, on what Clara did to my father, on uncovering the truth, that I never really thought about the future. And now that it's here, I don't know what to do." There was a moment of silence before Ethan turned to her, his expression thoughtful. "You've been through so much, Sophia. More than most people could ever understand. It's going to take time to figure out what you want. But now you've got a clean slate. You can do anything you want." Sophia sighed, leaning back into the couch. "That's the thing. I don't know what I want. I've spent my whole life just surviving, and now I have all these opportunities. But I feel lost." Ethan leaned forward, his eyes softening with understanding. "You're not lost. You're just free for the first time in a long time." Sophia met his gaze, feeling the weight of his words. He was right. She was free. Free from the weight of the past. Free from the secrets and lies that had defined her life for so long. She had the chance to rebuild, to create a life on her own terms. But what kind of life would that be? "I guess I'm just scared," Sophia admitted. "I'm not used to having choices." Ethan nodded, his eyes filled with understanding. "It's okay to be scared. But you've already shown how strong you are, Sophia. You took down Clara. You uncovered the truth about your father. You can handle whatever comes next." Sophia smiled faintly. "I couldn't have done it without you." Ethan shrugged, a playful grin tugging at the corner of his lips. "Maybe. But you're the one who decided to step up and take control. You saved my life, remember?" Ethan continued. "And you didn't back down when things got tough." A smile spread across Sophia's face, and for the first time in what felt like an eternity, she experienced a flicker of hope. She may not have all the answers just yet, but one thing was certain: she had her life back. She had choices, and she wasn't alone. Ethan had become much more than just an ally in this fight. Had become someone she could depend on. Someone who had seen her at her lowest and still chose to stand by her. As if sensing her thoughts, Ethan spoke again. "You don't need to figure it all out right now. Take it one day at a time. And if you ever need anything, you know where to find me." Sophia chuckled softly. "I might just take you up on that." They sat in comfortable silence for a while, watching the city lights start to twinkle as the sunset faded. The heavy weight that had been pressing down on Sophia's chest slowly began to lift. It wasn't completely gone, but it felt lighter now, more bearable. After a few moments, Ethan stood up to leave, offering her a reassuring smile before heading for the door. "Take care of yourself, Sophia. You've earned it." Sophia nodded, watching him leave. When the door clicked shut behind him, a strange sense of peace settled over her. The future was still uncertain, but for the first time in a long time, she wasn't afraid of it. She had faced far worse and come out on the other side. Whatever happened next, she knew she could handle it. In the weeks that followed, things moved quickly. Clara's trial began, and with all the overwhelming evidence stacked against her, the jury didn't deliberate for long. Guilty on all counts. As the sentence was read, Sophia watched Clara's face, feeling a deep sense of closure she hadn't expected. Clara's downfall was complete. Her wealth, her power, her legacy. Everything she had built was now gone. Liam's cooperation had been crucial in bringing the full scope of Clara's crimes to light. Though he wasn't innocent, his testimony earned him a reduced sentence. Sophia wasn't sure how to feel about Liam. He had been complicit in so many of Clara's crimes, but in the end, he had made the choice to do the right thing. It wasn't redemption, but it was something. With Clara behind bars and her criminal empire dismantled, it was a victory of sorts. Life for Sophia slowly began to return to some form of normal. She moved out of the luxurious apartment Ethan had given her and found a modest home of her own. A space where she could start fresh. It wasn't the high life she had once dreamed of. It was simple, comfortable. And that was more than enough. She wasn't interested in wealth or power anymore. She was focused on rebuilding her life from the ground up. Sophia found a new job, one that allowed her to put to use the skills she had developed over the years. She reconnected with old friends she had lost touch with, and little by little, she started healing from the trauma that had haunted her for so long. It wasn't easy, but it was real. It was hers. One evening, as she sat on her balcony, watching the sunset, Sophia found her thoughts drifting to her father. She wondered what he would think if he could see her now. If he would be proud of the woman she had become. She liked to think that he would be. She had fought for him, for his memory, and for her own sense of justice. And in the end she had won. She took a deep breath, feeling the cool evening air fill her lungs. The city below buzzed with the potential of 1,000 new possibilities, and for the first time in a long while Sophia felt truly at peace. She didn't have all the answers yet, but she had her life back, and for now that was enough.